Good evening. I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation for this interview. It is a pleasure to have you here to discuss one of the biggest threats and challenges of the 21st century. We're talking about terrorist threats and the role of the nation state in the age of globalization. As we all know, the 1990s and 2000s allowed the expansion of globalization in a period of time where non-state actors would rise to prominence as the single most important threat to international collective security. NATO's Article 5 was for the first time evoked vis-a-vis a terrorist organization. At the time, economic liberalization and democratization went hand in hand. As we enter the third decade of the 2000s, the notion of linear evolution of democracy and capitalism has diminished, not least because of China. In the West, we see both the erosion of the monopoly of violence and the surge of technologies that allow covert action. Now, more than ever, it is hard to know which is the biggest threat to home affairs, as small arms, surveillance software, and dangerous know-how become widely available. Professor Kenneth Hillas has served until 2013 as a senior foreign service officer for the US State Department. During his career, he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge of the US Embassy in Prague and the US Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. He has served as the State Department's Deputy Special Negotiator for Eurasian conflicts, mediating the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. His work on conflict resolution also focused on Abkhazia in Georgia and Transnistria in Moldova. Professor Hillas also teaches at the University of Maine Graduate School of Policy and International Affairs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Hillas, allow me to start with a question that it's important to understand and maybe share with us your experience and insight regarding non-state regimes such as Abkhazia and Transnistria, as I already mentioned in your resume. These regimes are often run by private interest trusts such as Sheriff. Do you feel that these vacuums of sovereignty are significant in the proliferation of terrorist threats?
Well, I think you can't divide the question of the use of violence or terrorism, and the two are not exactly the same. There are legitimate uses of violence by states. I do think that the whole question about the threat of terrorism has been somewhat overgeneralized or overapplied to situations that it shouldn't properly be applied to. So, for instance, the breakaway republics that you referred to, Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh are the ones we know most about in the former Soviet Union. The problem is, I think, a broader one than just terrorism. It's a question of how business interests fuse with intelligence services and get involved in criminal activities. A lot of these frozen conflicts perforce bring with them an element of smuggling, of illicit activities, whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking. And I mean, Sheriff, the entity you mentioned is a very sort of classic example of former intelligence officials who become principal stakeholders in a large economic enterprise that runs everything from gas stations to supermarkets and has soccer teams and very much dominates the Transnistrian economy. But when it comes to, is it a significant factor in the proliferation of terrorist threats? Sometimes yes, but more often not. It's, for instance, an example where it did would have been Russian support for bringing Chechen and other North Caucasus non-Russian nationalities into Abkhazia to defeat the Georgians during the 92-93 civil war there in Abkhazia. Some of the Islamist Chechen leaders later in the war against Russia cut their teeth in Abkhazia, Bashayev, for example. So it does happen. It can contribute to proliferation of terrorism, but I think the bigger threat is one of sort of criminalized pseudo-state entities that undermine international norms and pose a different kind of threat than that of terrorism. I mean, if you want to follow up or have another question, but I guess my answer is sometimes yes, but more often not a major cause of proliferation of terrorism.
Now that you mentioned them,
for example,
yes,
I'm sorry. For example, just to conclude, there are far more terrorists, the proliferation of terrorism or terrorists from marginalized, alienated, and powerless Muslims in Western Europe is a far bigger problem than the threat of terrorism emanating from these pseudo states that we've just mentioned.
And very, very interesting topics. And thank you for mentioning them. This difference in Europe and these set of states, as you mentioned, which leads me to my next question regarding the increasing privatization of war. We have seen this happening the last 2 decades, and from Russia's Wagner Group to Blackwater. Do you feel that this form of unregulated warfare supports or undermines U.S. national security?
Well, having been a beneficiary of Blackwater protection when I ran a provincial reconstruction team in South Central Iraq, I felt it was contributing to, at least to my security, and in a broader sense to U.S. national security. Even Russia's Wagner Group, I'm not sure I'd use the term sort of privatization of war. Governments over the last several decades have increasingly contracted out certain kinds of services just because it provides them flexibility to, you may have if you're involved in a counterinsurgency somewhere in the world, as the United States has been for the better part of the last 20 years, either in Afghanistan or Iraq or both, there was a need for security personnel. And so Blackwater fit that. Wagner Group exists and works in a different way, but they're essentially contracted by the Russian Federation. And they, unlike Blackwater, do get involved in combat operations, and they're involved in Mozambique as well. So it's a little bit of apples and oranges, Blackwater and Wagner. I don't think, I would say to sort of go a step further, there's much more oversight of an entity like Blackwater. Some of its employees were faced criminal charges until they were pardoned by President Trump.
Mhm.
There's a firm, and these security firms like Blackwater, it's a broader phenomenon. 70% of the U.S. intelligence community nowadays is the workforce is contracted. They're not U.S. government employees. So this, and I don't, the United States may be ahead of other countries in this regard. I mean, Edward Snowden was famously a contractor.
Exactly.
Had access to some of the most sensitive secrets the National Security Agency kept. So it's, and I think there is a fair amount of both the executive branch oversight and congressional oversight of the, contracted firms, whether it's Blackwater or others. Does it support or undermine U.S. national security? I guess the bottom line is that without firms like Blackwater, the United States would not have been able to pursue its national security interests, which you can disagree with whether those interests that previous administrations defined, but the government in power gets to be the one to say this is the U.S. national, our interests are A, B, and C. So I think the broader question of militias arises with when they're either the state, or particularly when the state cannot provide security. So for instance, you get multinational firms in the Democratic Republic of Congo that hire militias to provide security for their mining operations. We've seen over the last year a rise in militias in Afghanistan because the government forces continue to weaken, but these generally tend to be formed around or by warlords who are seeking to protect economic or tribal interests, and the state no longer is able to do that for them. So there's militias in Somalia are a famous example, where very weak state entity. And it's not just Al-Shabaab, it's, up in Somaliland, militias have created a fairly stable and secure environment. So, which doesn't work against U.S. national security interests. So I think it's a complicated question. It can work against U.S. interests. It depends on what these private entities or militias are what their objectives are, and it depends on what kind of support they have from if they have any from other states.
Mhm. Thank you, Professor Hillas. So at the end of the day, for this particular group, Blackwater, we are saying, if I understood well, that it doesn't undermine U.S. national security. At the end of the day, it helps the country for for its affairs externally, if I understood correctly, right?
Yes, right. Yeah. No, they're contracted and they worked for the U.S. government. They're not out winging it. Well, they're not supposed to be winging it. Occasionally, they did in Baghdad, they may get trigger happy, in which case they get held accountable.
Thank you, Professor Hillas. And my last question for you is, do you feel that proxy militia conflicts are a form of state-sponsored terrorism? If that is the case, how does the U.S. ensure it is on the right side of the history?
Okay, so that's two questions, actually, isn't it? So are proxy militia conflicts a form of state-sponsored terrorism? Sometimes yes, more often not the case. I can think of, Turkish-sponsored Islamist groups in Syria have been used against Syrian Kurds, and they've engaged, frankly, in acts of terrorism, and by that I mean trying to terrorize the civilian Kurdish population into, moving out of border areas along the Turkish-Syrian border. But the Turkish armed forces inflict far more violence on Kurds themselves than do their state-sponsored militias. I mean, the Turkish Air Force not infrequently will attack the Kurdish regional government in Iraq. Kurdish army will carry out incursions into the KRG, in search of PKK camps, and of course, over the last couple of years, the Kurdish security forces' actions against Kurds inside Turkey have been very repressive and violent. So there's no, I think, in the scheme of things, the militia is a small part, an example of Turkey. So yes, there are examples. In terms of the U.S. being on the right side of history, I'd say that placing human rights or making human rights, enshrining it as the primary interest of the United States would not likely result in the U.S. ending up on the right side of history. You can fight a noble battle and win the battle, but you can also, in winning the battle, you can still lose the war. So unless the United States is able to, in balancing its multiple interests, whether they're national security or economic or ethical or human rights, or preservation of its system of alliances, it has to balance those interests, and sometimes they come into conflict, as you well know from our course on the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. The conflict in interests is a constant for major world powers. I think that said, that there's always room for debate, question. For instance, Congress, when the Trump administration was overly supportive of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its actions in Yemen, including sort of what we might call, consider to be less than discriminating bombing inside Yemen, and the creation of militia forces inside Yemen to contest the Houthi rebels that had taken over most of the country. Congress intervened. President Trump was very resistant on restrictions that Congress wanted to impose. And the Biden administration has sort of rebalanced the whole relationship with Saudi Arabia to ensure that we're not directly or indirectly supporting actions that don't have an important or a significant impact on U.S. national security, but are something that Saudi Arabia seeks. So there's been this rebalancing, and that's evidenced in the decision to try to come back to the table on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement with Iran, which Saudi Arabia very much opposes. So it's the militias get involved in this, but it's usually a broader strategic picture of U.S. interests that are at play. I'll stop there. I'm more interested in listening to Professor Singleton.
So at the end of the day, as you said, it's about balance. Like being on the right side of history is a big challenge, but it's all about balance. Like, as you said, about the security of their alliances that we have, and also, of course, the human rights aspect. What do we do in this case? Thank you, Professor Hillas, very much for your contribution. Allow me to